Welcome. This is an interview with James Kurth, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Swarthmore College and author of The American Way of Empire, published by Washington Books. And full disclosure, I'm the publisher and editor of this book. We've had him on before to talk about world events. And there's been a lot of international tension recently, centered this time on Ukraine, where the United States and Russia are having a confrontation over the future of Europe. And Professor Kurth recently published January 7th in INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking website, a very important article, Fateful Collision, NATO's Drive to the East versus Russia's Sphere of Influence, which in part draws on some insights that are background material in chapter 9 of this book. So if you want to know where this is coming from, it's actually the dynamic was explained prior, but the realization is taking place in real time right now. And this is on the Institute for New Economic Thinking website. I'll put a link in the comments after we talk about it. And basically, there's a military standoff in Europe right now with 100,000 Russian troops. And there are threats of America. I read in the newspaper some of our people saying, turning Ukraine into another Afghanistan. With guerrilla bands and partisan attacks and so forth. And so everybody's very tense. What's going to happen? The conclusion of the INET paper is, will it all end with a negotiated settlement allowing for Russian vital interests, but also for American vital ideals? Or will it end with either a bang or a whimper? Or if the latter, whose whimper will it be? This time, the whole world is watching. And before I get to the question's answer, there was, as a result of that, an interview in the French Journal of Opinion, L'Opinion, which is a website and I think also a newspaper. Ukraine, American and Russian weapons have their limits, in which Professor Kurth was interviewed by Gilles Sanger, who is a French journalist who emailed me. He was just in the Ukraine. So he's covering this story very closely. And in that interview, Professor Kurth says, in French actually, but I translated it back into English, you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them, as Talleyrand told Napoleon. That's what's happening right now. Everyone's sitting on their bayonets. And at some point, as Professor Kurth says in the interview, the snows will melt and action will have taken place or not have taken place. And with that, I'm going to ask for a prediction or forecast or analysis from Professor Kurth. What do you see happening in the Ukraine?
Well, in regard to how I ended my particular article for INET, posing the question about a negotiated settlement, or possibly the whole affair ending with a bang, or the whole affair ending with a whimper, and then a question would be, well, who will be doing the whimpering? That is to say, Russia or the United States. Now, the way it looks now, at the very beginning of the second week of negotiations, or rather after the first week of negotiations, which largely issued in nothing, and therefore ups the ante in the minds of the Russians, makes them even more impatient. But the way it looks now is in terms of that kind of options of alternatives, I do think it's more likely that it will end with Russia insisting one way or another, either US and NATO giving it to them, or much more likely, since they won't, Russia will itself take it on its own it will end with the Russians making a major change in the strategic balance, or more broad, the strategic balance. That includes the military balance, but it also includes the economic balance now existing between the United States as the leader of NATO and the Russian Federation. So here's what I think is the most likely outcome. The United States and NATO will essentially not agree to anything. They'll agree to negotiate and to talk and to talk and to talk. The Russians already warned the United States and NATO in late December. President Putin referred to this in his own press conference on December 23, his annual end of the year press conference. He said that we will not be strung out by negotiations and talking and talking. We need to have formal agreement signed and guaranteed by the United States and NATO, and it needs to happen expeditiously. And at the end of the first week of negotiations last week, the negotiator, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Rybakov, he said the same thing. No more talk. There has to be action on the part of the United States and NATO. And so the result of the first week was that the Russians were confirmed in their idea of how the United States was going to game this, to play them. And that's made them even more impatient and potentially impetuous. So this does mean that we're not going to get a very negotiated settlement soon, because the Americans simply are in no mood to do that. They are following their ancient playbook ever since the United States made its first advance in NATO with the admission of, let's say, of NATO into the East, the former Soviet area. Their first advance when they admitted the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary in 1999. The Russians have been protesting against that and every other expansion eastward of NATO, and the Americans have already always de facto ignored them and say, oh, well, let's talk about it. And now the Russians, 20 years later, are impatient and impetuous. They think they're in a position of power so that they don't have to listen to that kind of talk and delay again. So I think they're going to take action. Then there is the question on what action they will take. But before I move into that, would you have any questions on what I've said thus far?
No, although how can you say if somebody's been waiting 20 years that they're impatient? It would seem to me the Russians have been extremely patient.
Well, what has happened in the last 2 or 3 years, certainly, and even earlier, which the Russians have been noticing, and other revisionist powers, other words, powers that want to revise the existing global order and to their advantage by regaining territories that historically were in their country, or if they had an empire in their empire, in their territory. Those three revisionist powers are Russia, and then much more important and larger, China, and rather smaller and less important, Iran. Each of these three powers have been observing what's been happening in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years, and especially the last year. They've observed the increasing polarization and fragmentation in the American political order. They have observed that with the Biden administration, the polarization and fragmentation has even been enhanced. Instead of just polarization between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, now it's polarization within the Democratic Party itself, between the Democratic establishment associated with Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee, and the Democratic radicals, the progressives, such as those associated with AOC and her squad in Congress. And that means even the Democratic Party is fragmented. Within the Biden administration, insofar as there is an administration, Biden is obviously incapable of organizing an administration. And so therefore, each of the government agencies, including the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, they're kind of on autopilot. they do what's according to their kind of standard operating procedures for their particular agency. And so that leads to more fragmentation, even within the so-called Biden administration. And so what each of the three revisionist powers have been seeing in the last year is the pre-existing polarization and disorder in the American political system, giving rise to policy immobility, immobilism, as the French used to call it. They see this even more enhanced in this kind of paralyzed, palsied, so-called democratic Biden administration. And so therefore, they see this as an auspicious moment, a time to seize the opportunity. And they are therefore looking to press now, while the United States, and within it, the Democratic Party, and within that, the Biden administration are so immobilized and fragmented and can really do nothing than pre-existing autopilots, policies and processes. And they watched all of those, so they know how to counter them. So this is why this is happening now, rather than sometime in the last 10, 15 years, when the United States had far more coherence and far more power. It's reinforced by the fact, that Putin himself also thinks that the United States on autopilot has been actually expanding. Just because the administration is incoherent doesn't mean that the State Department, the Defense Department, the Central Intelligence Agency haven't been pushing forward according to their pre-existing protocols that go back at least to the Ukrainian crisis of 2013, 2014, and that is to pour more and more weapons, advisors, assistance into Ukraine, even without them coming into NATO. They're making it de facto in terms of weapons presence, a NATO, a kind of para member of NATO. And so the Russians think they have to stop that. So simultaneously, they see a military threat coming closer to Russia in Ukraine, which, if you look at the map, is a soft underbelly, and hundreds of kilometers of border between Russia to the north, Ukraine to the south. They see a greater and greater threat happening now, and they see a greater and greater weakness in the capacity of the United States to respond coherently and intelligently. And so that's why they're pushing now.
Okay. With that analysis, I'd like to bring up recent developments in Kazakhstan. What relation do you think the confrontation in Kazakhstan, which some said was a failed color revolution, some said was an authentic uprising of the Kazakh people, some said was a clan dispute between various power factions, has to what's going on right now in the Ukraine? My own view, it was a dress rehearsal for the Ukraine, and perhaps also designed as a diversionary measure to pull Russian troops away. But that said, it seems by acting swiftly, the Russians did in fact crush the rebellion. Their 8,000 people reportedly were arrested. Who knows how many were shot immediately? A lot probably left. And there were reports, just as I suspected, of there being Islamic fundamentalists among the rebels, which is consistent with American Central Asian policy for 20 years at least, as we know. So what is your analysis of Kazakhstan's role in this?
Well, as you pointed out, there are two interpretations of what caused the uprising in December and early January. And these two interpretations correspond to the kind of political positions, indeed the national positions of the interpreters. The conventional American position, and to some extent, more broadly, the European, with America, NATO position, is, oh, well, the incompetence and the venality of the Kazakh leadership and oligarchs led to vast inequality. And then recently there was a big hike in fuel prices and other things of that sort. And therefore there was a spontaneous uprising coming on the heels of a growing discontent with the small, tiny, rich minority and the large, poor majority in Kazakhstan. There was a legitimate uprising against that, sparked by the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, and that was the fuel and other resource sudden increase in prices and availability. And so that's a conventional interpretation, and that can be true as far as it goes. However, as you pointed out, there's an alternative interpretation. And this interpretation can be found more in some of the European press, and it can certainly be found amongst the Russians. And that was, this was yet another pre-planned color revolution on the part of the United States and its national security agencies, especially the CIA, working through NGOs that then promote Islamism or any kind of opposition in the country. And they had been planning on looking for a moment of opportunity to turn their plan to have a color revolution into an apparently spontaneous uprising. And so it means from the Russian, or more broadly, we might say, the left-wing critical of American foreign policy position, the two explanations are not contradictory. Rather, the idea of the spontaneous uprising simply flows out of, at a moment of opportunity for the United States to execute a long existing plan to have a counter-revolution in Kazakhstan. After all, in the mid-2000s, there was a color revolution in Kyrgyzstan, one of those other Central Asian former Soviet republics. And in addition, there was a color revolution in Ukraine in 2004, following the same playbook. And from the Russian perspective, that playbook was played again in 2013 in Ukraine in the Maidan Revolution. So they see within the former Soviet bloc, the former Soviet Union, they see at least 3 episodes prior to Kazakhstan of a color revolution. And indeed, there was a 4th. In the summer of 2020, there was a similar spontaneous demonstrations in Minsk that were more broadly Belarus against the Lukashenko regime, that is a very pro-Russian regime in Belarus. And so they see this is what the Americans do, especially the State Department, the CIA, and their little adjuncts, the NGOs, plus certain big foundations like the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy in the United States. They see all of this as part of a general strategy, a general operational code by the United States. Of course, they also notice color revolutions in other countries, such as in Syria in the middle of the 2000s and so on. So from their point of view is, with Kazakhstan, the Russians thought, there the Americans go again. Well, if they're going to go again, we're going in. And so they gave instant support to the Kazakh regime. And it turned out that support, plus the Kazakh regime being ruthless and efficient on its own to protect its power, that turned out to be very effective. So the Russians now think, ha, 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 see, the Americans played their own playbook. But we have a new playbook who knows how to handle that well. And we did it. Of course, the Russians think, oh, the Americans thought that's so clever. Have a color revolution. That will throw the Russians off balance in Ukraine. Well, it's just the opposite. Now, Putin thinks, and the national security establishment in Russia think, see, we did it our way, we did it effectively, and now we've cleared the decks to focus on Ukraine. In addition, they can say, oh, that's what we did in Belarus. Oh, the Western media in 2020 were saying, oh, Belarus, that regime is on the skids. It's going to collapse. And it didn't. No. The Russians propped up, not with military intervention, but certainly a lot of security assistance from their own security agencies. They propped up the Belarus regime, and it's firmly in power again. So now the Russians can say, see, the Americans tried their color revolution playbook twice recently, and they failed in both. That just reinforces in our minds, the Russian national security establishment talking to itself, we know how to do these things, and the Americans are bumbling incompetence. Too clever by half.
All right. Well, with that said, let's go on to the issues in your INET article and interview. What happens next?
Well, then this picks up what I was saying. The Russians now, I believe, think they have to act because they said they would act if the Americans simply wanted to talk. And Wendy Sherman and Anthony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, the deputy secretary of state, and Anthony Blinken, the secretary of state, they've just said the whole thing, the American thing, completely predictable from the point of view of the Russians. Oh, we should continue to talk, we should continue to talk, we should continue to talk. And now the Russians are going to say, okay, we're going to show you, this is a whole different game. This is going to be the serious stuff. So I think they're going to have to act. But there are many ways in which they can act. Now, one way of acting is within Ukraine itself. But even there are four different stages of escalation in operating militarily in Ukraine. A second way is to act militarily someplace else. That could be in Belarus, reinforcing the troops there, reinforcing the government there by putting Russian troops in Belarus on the borders with the NATO allies of Poland and Lithuania. Or they could act militarily with increasing exercises and risk-taking in the Baltic Sea and near the Baltic republics. Or they could act militarily by increasing exercises in the Black Sea and against the NATO members the NATO members of Romania and Bulgaria. And so those are just the military, kinetic warfare, actual moving hard weapons like tanks and armored personnel carriers. That was so 20th century. Now we have the 21st century. This is the time of information war, cyber war. Well, the Russians are very experienced in conducting cyber war against their adversaries. They did it first with Estonia in 2006. They really perfected that one. Then they're doing it to America, as we know, in various ways over the last several years. And over the weekend, they did it to Ukraine. They essentially shut down the Ukrainian government offices, plus a number of the other government-supported installations like banks, I think maybe even some hospitals. They've already engaged in shots across the bow in cyber war, showing we can do that. So they don't even have to use old-fashioned industrial era kinetic warfare. They can use new-fashioned information age cyber war. It will still be militarily. Now, before I go into some other elements in the Russian playbook, their playbook, whose title is Hybrid Warfare, or subtitle 50 Shades of Gray, a gray zone. That's their playbook. And they have a lot more of these innovative things that are not just boring, although in a way dramatic, but so old-fashioned military kinetic things, or even the new stuff, cyber war. Oh no, we have other things we can do. But before I go on to that, maybe you can ask any questions you have where I am thus far in the military stuff.
Oh, well, this is fascinating to me. I didn't realize they were so advanced in cyber warfare and new techniques.
Well, those of us living on the eastern seaboard last spring who were dependent upon energy on the colonial pipeline company, we did notice as the specter of gasoline and gas, fuel and heat, suddenly it looked like they might disappear until some behind the scenes and under the table payoffs ensured that. But everybody thinks that's what the Russians did.
Huh. So how will the United States counter these sophisticated techniques? Do we have the capability to prevail?
Well, we've got a good answer to that. How have we prevailed against Russian hackers, cyber war attacks on American corporations, government agencies, how have we prevailed in the last couple of years? We're always behind the power curve.
So you actually don't think we have the cyber
That's right,
advantage?
we don't. Oh, we can do something. We can do something like the Polish cavalry did against the tanks, the Panzer Corps of the Wehrmacht in 1939. Oh, they did something. It was very heroic, but they were utterly smashed.
So do you think that a analysis of the current correlation of forces by an objective party would say that the Russians have the advantage?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you used a word or phrase very common with the Russians. It ought to be more common with the Americans, especially the military, the correlation of forces. That's another term for the military balance. But of course, in the Russian mentality, this is certainly true today, but it was also true during the Soviet Union. It's even true during the time of Imperial Russia under the Tsars. They always knew that in the advanced weaponry of the day, the Western powers, the leading Western power who might be their adversary today, be it going backwards, the Americans in the Cold War, or the Germans in the Second World War and the First World War, or the French in the Napoleonic Wars, or even earlier, the Swedes at the time of Peter the Great. All those Western powers always had higher technology than the Russians had at that time. And the Russians knew they had to trump the Western quality with something else. The classical way was to trump Western quality with Russian quality. Quantity. They may have better, but we have more. And as Lenin once said, quantity has a quality all its own. If you can swamp quality with lots of quantity, vast numbers of Russian troops, for example, to take the old-fashioned way, that's a good way. But much more interesting and subtle, they always had developed these non-kinetic ways of undermining the Western advantages in their high technology and their high technology weaponry. They had always developed alternative ways. One, of course, was espionage. Another was subversion. Another was disinformation. The Russians became experts in what the Soviets called compromise, seducing Westerners into compromising situations and then blackmailing them. They were the world-class experts in that. They even were that prior under the Tsars. And so not just to take a rather old-fashioned way of 50 Shades of Gray. And so that's in their playbook. Well, after the Russians noticed the American tremendous high-tech military superiority in the Gulf War, where the United States fought Iraq in 1991, after they noticed that, and the Chinese and the Iranians also noticed that, the Russians decided, well, we can't meet the Americans head on in high-tech weaponry. We have to develop alternative things while all the time we're doing everything we can to catch up with them as far as we can with high tech. But the alternative things developed into a whole theory of hybrid warfare, and to fight in 7 or 8 different domains. Other military domains, like I've mentioned, cyber war, other kind of political propaganda domains, and economic domains, which I haven't had a chance to mention yet.
And do you think the Russians have an advantage in all of these domains? Is there anywhere the United States can outmatch them in a confrontation?
Well, I think that in the military domain, in the local theater, that is to say, Ukraine and the immediate area around it, the Russians have clear military superiority, even in the classical American superiority within the military of being more high tech. The Russians have not been sitting still on high technology since 1991. They have developed some of the most effective, not just anti-aircraft and missile defense systems on the planet, but they've also now developed extremely efficient missiles, such as these hypersonic missiles. And so they can pretty much match our quality in many ways. But in addition, in that local theater, they have tremendous quantity. In other words, since 1991, the time that the Soviet Union fell apart and the time that the Americans deployed their high technology military against Iraq, which incidentally had been trained by the Soviet Union, which demonstrated again and humiliated the Soviet military people because of the American victory in Iraq. But in the time since then, the Russians really did move forward along these lines, and so they got better militarily. At the same time, NATO got worse. But we thought we had won the Cold War. Now it's the end of history. Now we can have globalism in the full sense all around the globe. We can press it in all directions. We'll press it southward, developing countries. We'll press it eastward towards what had been the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc. And we, as Madeleine Albright said, we stand tall, we see far, we're the universal nation. Well, under those circumstances, who needs an efficient military? And so today, the American forces in NATO are a shadow, even a parody of their former self. Today, they've got the capability, the NATO forces, to not, let's say, fight Russia in that NATO theater between the Baltic and the Black Sea, but especially in the Ukraine area. They don't have a capacity to do that. They don't even have a capacity to, well, they probably could fight something like Poland if it was a communist Poland, but it's not a communist Poland.
Let me ask you a question. Why then would the United States be provoking what could be a military confrontation with Russia at this time when, if it actually started, we would lose?
Well, this is a fascinating thing. During the Cold War, every time that the United States, its leadership, considered some extension of a military commitment, a military guarantee, like when early on in the Cold War, they extended the original NATO to Greece and Turkey, and then later to West Germany, when West Germany had been largely rehabilitated. This is in 1955, largely rehabilitated after the crimes and catastrophes of the Second World War. When they extended that, the American political elite worked closely with the American military elite to make sure that any commitment would be backed by a military capability, or at least credibility. And so that was all very carefully considered. They saw a seamless web between political policy and military strategy. Well, that all disappeared with the end of the Cold War. And the political elite, especially amongst the Democrats, they thought, well, we don't need military any longer. And so we can just focus on our values, our democracy, as they call it now. Where their democracy is not quite the democracy that the non-democratic party of the United States considers a democracy, but our democracy essentially was composed of open society, market economies, universal human rights, and it's all summed up in the phrase that Anthony Blinken and everyone else at the top level of the administration repeats again and again and again: the global order of rules and norms. Global order of rules and norms. Now they're like parrots or round-up toys, cackling away. And every time they get into negotiation, including with the serious, no-nonsense revisionist powers, they talk about rules and norms. The last thing they talk about is military power. There's a total disconnect between the foreign policy and the military capability to back it up. This is reinforced by the fact that during the Cold War, some of our national security advisors, and on occasion, some of our secretaries of state, had actually been in the military. The most distinguished of all, who perfectly understood how to integrate foreign policy and military strategy, was the beloved and saintly George C. Marshall. But there were others, like at the end of the Cold War, there was General Scowcroft, who was in the George H.W. Bush administration. They understood this intimate connection. But other secretaries of state, they knew war. They had seen the devastation of World War II, most of all, Henry Kissinger. Also, the National Security Advisor in the Carter administration, Zbigniew Brzezinski. These were serious, no-nonsense people. They put foreign policy and military strategy together. Well, if you look at the educational background, the professional background of the Biden administration and earlier the Obama administration, those professional degrees have nothing to do with professional degrees in anything like international security, in public policy schools teaching that, or maybe graduate departments insofar as they still teach at graduate departments in political science. No. They have degrees from Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, Columbia Law School. Oh, they know perfectly. Well, they're at the top of the class in international law, in rules and norms. That's all they know.
But let me ask you a question. If what you're saying is that this is in fact a dangerous moment, and if military conflict appears likely, and if Russia seems to have an advantage, wouldn't this be a disaster if it spiraled out of control? I mean, isn't this almost like the mobilization before World War I?
Oh, I agree. Although I think the military move, now you're putting together quite a few military moves here all at once. And I was saying that they're part of a playbook. Putin doesn't have to use them all. He doesn't have to move into Ukraine as long as he makes some move that will throw the US and NATO off balance and do it publicly. Some of those are military moves. I mentioned what they were. More military operations in Belarus or in the Baltic or in the Black Sea. Some can be cyber war attacks, don't even have to be kinetic movement of forces. Cyber war attacks, but still military, although attacks on the economy. I haven't even mentioned the economic things. He has many things he can do. And then he could say, well, the Americans did their typical thing. They strung us on. They did their typical thing. They talked about talking, negotiations. And when they talk about rules and norms. Well, we are finished with that. And you Russian people, you're finished with that. And so here's what I've done. I've shown the Americans. And then he will say publicly that he did this or that. And that means he deployed 3 or 4 of the different things in the playbook.
What about the argument that it seems to be the American side? One, they can support guerrilla war in Ukraine. 2, economic sanctions, that Russia is a poor, weak country that couldn't withstand a sanction regime.
Okay, I'll take both of those. Now, the guerrilla war. In a way, this is Americans talking about the Ukrainians, lest you and the Russians fight. We'll fight to the last Ukrainian, and you're doing it in guerrilla war, which of course is the most devastating war for the civilians around it. So they're saying the Ukrainians will rise up and fight. Well, yes and no. There are essentially three parts of Ukraine. There's the eastern part with a large Russian speaking population. There's the central part that is very much a Ukrainian population insofar as there's any Ukrainian nationality based upon Ukrainian history, including the Eastern Orthodox religion of Ukraine. And then there's the western part of Ukraine, which actually was under the Habsburg Empire. And that means it's completely different. It's not Eastern Orthodox, it's Eastern Rite of the Roman Catholic Church. So their history, Habsburg and Catholic, is much different than the history of the two other parts of Ukraine, Central and Eastern. And they are essentially Eastern Orthodox and under the czars. So it's a very different history. It's even different alphabets. And so that's a difference. Well, why is this important in terms of the question of guerrilla war? Well, it happened that from 1947 to 1953, there was a tremendous guerrilla war in Ukraine against the Soviet forces that had been restored there in the course of the Russian victory in the Second World War. There were absolute, very fierce guerrilla warfare against the Soviets. And the KGB and other Russian military forces lost more than 12,000 dead in this guerrilla war. But it wasn't in the eastern part of Ukraine, centered on Kharkov. The central part of Ukraine centered on Kiev. It was centered on the western part of Ukraine, which was centered on Lvov, which in the Habsburg Empire was called Lemberg. Now, the Western Ukrainians, already I said, were culturally distinct from all those Ukrainians to the east. That's where the guerrilla warfare was. Also, since that part of Ukraine was the closest to the Western countries, the United States could aid that guerrilla war with CIA and other things.
Let me just stop you right there. Do you see one possible result if there's a military move, a partition of Ukraine, sort of like North and South Korea, East and West Berlin, with Western Ukraine going to the West and Eastern Ukraine going to Russia? I mean, that's a historic fault line.
Yes, yes, I see that. And this is very important. In other words, instead of the Russians invading Ukraine, and the first stop on the locomotive, the Russian locomotive on the railroad leading westward to Ukraine, westward to and through Ukraine, the first stop would be to occupy fully, officially, the area in the Donbass that the Russian-supported rebellion against Ukraine occurs. In other words, the Oblast of Luhansk and Donetsk. They would incorporate that, and then the entire coast along the Sea of Azov, leading down to Mariupol and so forth. That's the first stop. That would essentially formalize in a dramatic way, sort of like what they did with Crimea in a dramatic way in 2014. And Putin could therefore present that as a victory. But the Russian people would know, well, that's really not much of a victory. All the more so, since at this point, the Americans would pour vast amounts of weapons, and they would dragoon the other NATO powers to come along with them. See what the Russians have done? They would then end up with not just the the other 2/3 of Ukraine, but actually the area I'm talking about the Russians would occupy only the kind of eastern 1/2 or 1/3 of eastern Ukraine. And so the Russians would get this little sliver, sort of like they got East Germany at the end of the Cold War, and the Americans would get the big enchilada. Excuse me, it wouldn't be that. I guess big samovar, which would be the much of the rest of Ukraine, and they would make it de facto a member of NATO. Well, Putin knows that. The Russian national security establishment know that, so they can't do that. They would be sitting on they'd be sitting on bayonets and not doing anything, because all those other people to the west of them would be becoming armed to the teeth, not with bayonets, but with missiles. So that wouldn't be a good place to stop. So then you might say, oh, the Russians could go further. The further west they go, the more they run into stronger and stronger Western resistance, and therefore greater and greater Western justification to arm the remaining part, the western part of Ukraine, to the teeth, to the missiles. And so that's why I think Putin is actually de facto very reluctant to start the military locomotive going westward, because there's no viable stopping point that will end up better than it is now. It will end up with the Russians being in some of the disadvantages they had during the Cold War. And so this means that he will try to play, I think, other military cards, as I've mentioned already, or play economic cards. That will get us into the topic you mentioned about the sanctions, which I'll mention.
Yeah, actually, what are Russia's economic cards? Because everything I read in the media here says Russia has no chance with economic warfare.
Okay, so here is the Western way of thinking. This will be in the Western media, and the American way of thinking, especially in the American media, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, their financial pages, and in the Treasury Department. Okay, we can execute sanctions, and we can fine tune the sanctions. We can execute sanctions against Russia as a whole. We can institute sanctions against Russian oligopoly state-supported enterprises. We can exercise sanction against virtually any particular individual or collection of individuals in the Russian government and in the oligarchy. We have these wonderful sanctions, and they work. They work. See, that's they work. Okay, and just to make sure that you understand that, they are saying we have complete control of the SWIFT system, the system of global financial exchanges. All countries, including the Russians, need to get foreign exchange, and we can control that. We can cut off their access to foreign exchange. We don't even have to have embargoes. We just cut off their capacity to finance these things. And so that's what we did with the Iranians. That's what we're going to do with the Russians if they do that. That's our Trump. Oh, I couldn't say Trump because you're in the Biden Treasury Department. No, but that we can play that card, and the Russians will just quake and quiver, and we'll have a victory. Well, the Russians know about that. And so they have carefully built up their foreign exchange reserves. They have the second or third largest foreign exchange reserves in the world today, more than half a $500 billion. So that's a little, that you might think that's their strategic monetary reserve. But in addition, much more subtly, they have their own, dare I say, trump card. Why? If the Americans impose economic sanctions, especially financial sanctions, we can impose economic sanctions, especially energy sanctions, all of Central Europe, and indeed much of Western Europe. Certainly the countries along the borders with Russia, and even Germany, they're utterly dependent, especially dependent in the winter. This long, cold winter that we are now in, the bleak midwinter, they're dependent upon their heating, their gasoline, on Russian oil and gas. It's not just the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but there's a Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And indeed, there's the pipeline through Ukraine. We've already cut that off from time to time just to get the power we were having some dispute with. like Ukraine, or maybe Austria, or maybe Lithuania. We've already cut that off in the past. We can do it again on an even larger scale. And so this winter, you Europeans will learn what it means to live with a Russian winter. We can produce a Russian winter in your nice little homes in Western Europe. And we're just cut off the fuel. So if the Americans sanction us, we're sanctioning the Europeans.
But do you think that the Americans care about that? Didn't they want to ship LNG to substitute?
Yes, they did. They had actually liked that, but they're not going to freeze to death in the dark. It's the Europeans.
Right.
So, see, they can split NATO perfectly. And indeed, within NATO, the British and the French, they don't get their energy from Russia. What do we care? But the Germans, they're the big ones. They're the big ones there now, big country in Europe. And once the British left the European Union, they essentially dominate the European, with the French coming along like a poodle. And so, now, what could really happen is that, like in 1914, on the eve of the war, each of the major powers thought they had the decisive battle plan that was much better than the battle plan of the opposing side. And with their decisive battle plan, they would execute that and win the war very quickly. As the Kaiser told his troops in August of 1914, home by Christmas. Well, that didn't happen because they all executed their wonderful battle plans. And when they all collided, they stalemated each other. And then you had four years of trench warfare. Wars of attrition replaced wars of maneuver very quickly. Well, you could have both sides think the financial weapon is the decisive weapon. They both play it. And by the end of the day, everybody is in a catastrophic economic situation.
All right. I think we're running out of time because I only get an hour or so. I don't know how long Zoom will give me. So I think we'll save other topics for another conversation. But I do have one last question. You said they have to act this winter. When will we know what's going to happen? I mean, right now, this is the calm before the storm.
No, I misspoke, or I misled you. There are two seasons coming up. In each case, the Russians have a problem. But let me explain. In the winter, and they're much better prepared for winter warfare than the NATO forces and even the Ukrainian forces. That's proven by the fact that they've been out there in the cold ever since mid-December. In the winter, that's much more difficult to have operations, but the Russians can engage in those operations better than the alternative. So they may move in the winter. In addition, however, when the weather gets better, as in spring, in that part of the world, the ice and snow turns to mud and slush. In other words, general mud comes in and replaces general winter. And that is immobile for everybody. Now, this is the case both in the Russian part, both parts of Russia, both sides of the Ukrainian-Russian border. You have this very cold, beneath 0 degrees Fahrenheit weather that we have now. And then you have, come March, 2 or 3 months of Russian and Ukrainian mud. That's very immobile for rapid forces. So that means if Putin is going to use his military forces in Ukraine, he really has to use them before the Ides of March, let's say. But I'm suggesting he's got a lot more attractive options to use. Because if he uses the military option in Ukraine, then he gets each station, as the Russian military locomotive moves westward, each station gets more and more difficult for him. But even the first station, the mere little minimal thing of annexing Donbass and the area around the Sea of Azov, even that is an unstable equilibrium. So I think he is likely to be driven to some other alternative.
All right, so we'll just have to stay tuned. That was a very sophisticated answer. We don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly what, but we know the present status quo cannot continue indefinitely, and something's going to break pretty soon, and it could lead to World War III, or it could lead to a negotiated settlement, or it could lead to something in between, as you're suggesting, that goes
On
on.
the eve of the First World War, nobody thought a First World War would break out. They didn't even think a major European would break out. But then when it broke out, then, or at least when the Bosnian crisis occurred in the Balkans, it appeared that it's going to be escalating to at least an Eastern European war and possibly a European war, then everybody thought, oh, well, the great powers who do what they've done in the past in this or that Balkan crisis, they'll come together and negotiate a settlement. So, but then, of course, it turned out that didn't happen. And so within 2 months after the Bosnian crisis, the great powers were at war, and they continued to be at war for 4 years. And at the end of the day, 2 of the great powers and their empires had totally collapsed. The German and the, 3, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, and the Russian. And so nobody knew. All the experts, if they had been interviewed immediately after the Bosnian crisis, or immediately after the beginning of the World War I in early August of 1914, nobody would have predicted what we actually got, which was the most terrible catastrophe in Western civilization up to that date.
All right, on that sober note, I think we'll wrap it up. For those who want more background on this situation, there's Professor Kurth's book, The American Way of Empire, How America Won a World but Lost Her Way. And if you want a short version, there's the INET, Institute for New Economic Thinking article on their website, Fateful Collision, NATO's Drive to the East versus Russia's Sphere of Influence. And if you want an even shorter read, there's the L'Opinion interview with Gilles Sanger, Ukraine, American and Russian weapons have their limits. I want to thank you for a very insightful and enlightening analysis. I'm hoping we don't end up in World War III, but if we do, we can say you told us so. And we'll come back later to talk about the other issues of Iran and China as developments proceed. So thank you very much. And we look forward to finding out what's going to happen with Ukraine. Okay, I will stop the recording now.